you look, it's harder and harder for the middle class to make it. Over 50% of the people now, when I wrote the book, it was 40%. Over 50% of the people now of the working Americans live paycheck to paycheck.
The reality is one of the reasons we have such a huge national debt isn't necessarily all due to Congress. It's also due to demand. It's also due to how we've structured the global economy in the sense that we are the global reserve currency, and one person's debt is another person's asset. And so treasuries, you could look at it the opposite way and say there's $35 trillion of treasuries out there held by people who are believers, and they hold it because it's the great place, and especially at today's interest rates, it's a great place to hold money.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show, the home of Googleization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy, never normal shift going on all around us. Our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the ever-changing convergence of people, business, and technology. Here is your host, Ira Wolf.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show and another edition of our new monthly series at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street, where we're talking each month about the intersection of the economy, politics, community, and technology. We realize you have a lot of listening and watching options and are grateful you've taken the time to join us today. Joining me once again at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street will be two familiar guests, Matt Van Alystne and John Aidan Byrne. In addition, we have a special guest on each episode, and this month we're thrilled to welcome acclaimed business entrepreneur, best-selling author, and get this, the father of modern cheerleading, Jeff Webb. You'll hear more about and from Jeff in just a few minutes. On today's show, we're going to tackle a vexing and provocative problem, the shrinking middle class. There are many reasons why this is important, but at the top of the list is it is the middle class that is likely to decide who the next U.S. president will be. But the importance of the middle class goes well beyond the election, and that's why we're so excited to have Jeff here today. Let me just offer a few disturbing trends that I uncovered while prepping for this conversation relating to the middle class, and also which you can find a whole lot more in Jeff's book, which we'll be talking about. The share of Americans in the middle class has fallen since 1971, but also the share of total U.S. household income held by the middle class has plunged since 1971 as well. 4 in 10 children in the U.S. live in lower income households, while only 1 live in upper income. And about 1/3 of U.S. workers in the information financial services sectors are in the upper income tier. There's a whole lot more that we'll get into, and beyond that of why that's taken place. But before I welcome Matt, John, and Jeff to the Googleization Nation stage, I want to thank Jim Toes and Security Traders Association for sponsoring today's show. You can join STA at their flagship event, the 91st Annual Market Structure Conference. This year's theme is Shifting the Landscape and is scheduled for September 18 to 20 at the JW Marriott Grand Lakes in Orlando. You can learn more about STA and the conference at the STA website, www.securitytraders.org. Now it's time to dig into this middle class mayhem and its implications for the economy, business, and our communities. I am pleased to welcome back Matt Van Alystne, co-founder and managing partner of Odeon Capital Group, a leading full-service boutique broker-dealer to institutional clients. Many of you know Matt from his commentary on this show and also his outlook on the highly rated Odeon Capital Conversations podcast. John Aidan Byrne is a veteran Wall Street business journalist, editor, filmmaker, and successful podcast host of Odeon Capital Conversations and Dig Life Deep. And John's newest ventures are 2 movie projects, one on the legendary life of a Wall Street CEO and scholar, and the other on Norman Rockwell. And our special guest, as I mentioned, he's an acclaimed business entrepreneur. He's CEO of Human Events Media Group, which includes digital platforms, The Post Millennial and Human Events. He's the founder of Varsity Spirit and the president of the International Cheer Union. He's widely recognized as the father of modern cheerleading, and he revolutionized the sport by establishing, if I can speak, varsity spirit, which has become a global leader in cheerleading. He's also the author of the Amazon best-selling American Restoration, How to Unshackle the Great Middle Class. As an aside, Jeff secured cheerleading as an official Olympic sport, although I don't believe we'll be seeing it next week at its launch. So it's time to welcome everybody to the Googleization stage. There's John, Matt, and Jeff. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Good to be here.
So, Jeff, your book's fascinating, and I can say, from that, although we've just met literally minutes ago, our political affiliations are probably polar opposites. Reading your book and I agree with everything.
Oh.
So it's from, I don't know everything, but I mean in general the outcomes and the intentions and the suggestions and the accountability that you're suggesting that needs to take place and a shift is remarkable, which just shows that regardless of where your stance is, what your attitude is, we're all agreeing on the outcome that we need change. So again, I thank you for that. As I said, although we probably have very, very, very different stances of where we came from, but I pulled up some stats and just to share some graphs. And again, I think one you might have shared in your book. Some of the others were more recent. I think your book came out in 2021, 22, or was at least written in that time frame. But this was from Statista, and they drew this from Pew Research. It's pretty dramatic from 1970, 71 to 2021, and again, so this would have been about the time your book came out. That the lower income percentages, the number of people versus the aggregate income. So the number of people in the lower income class was increased 4%, almost 20%. But their income, the amount of income that they had was spread out, even further. And then you look at the jump in the high income class. There was a good news is that 21, increase almost 50% of the number of people moved into the high income class. But their share of aggregate income was, almost doubled as well. That half of the income is held by 21% of the population, right. Which is creating this problem. So I think when we talk about, if you just talk about, and this is an issue in some of the, I'll say, agendas or propaganda, whichever side of the aisle you're on, of which direction that we're moving is, we are probably better off. We are wealthier, higher wages, higher retirement accounts, income accounts. But the problem is it's not distributed fairly.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, the numbers show it. I mean, it's pretty stark. And the bad news is it's not getting better. It's getting worse. And, there's a lot of speculation on what does this trend mean if it continues on and on and on. And I've had people ask me, is this going to be what's going to happen? What's our country going to look like? When you really look at the kind of the American economic engine, which was the greatest in the world, frankly, which I as you know from reading the book, I feel like you can kind of start at the end of World War II when the GIs came home and they got their education, started families, and started up the corporate ladder. We built this incredible middle class with, compared to other countries, a very, very affluent and large middle class. I think that's what's made the difference in America and the rest of the world, and it's what really sets us apart, among other things. But I think it's an important element in the differentiation. And again, as when you start looking at the last 20 years or so, 25 years ago, the squeeze began to occur, where the people had just smaller and smaller amounts of disposable income. Both parents, when I was a child, for a while, we had one person working in my family. I grew up very much a middle-class family, but we were able to get by. We went to decent public schools. I mean, we were able to get by. We didn't consider ourselves poor, that's for sure. But, again, as you look, it's harder and harder for the middle class to make it. Over 50% of the people now, when I wrote the book, it was 40%. Over 50% of the people now of the working Americans live paycheck to paycheck. That means they don't have any extra money for a medical emergency, to put toward their kids' college tuition, to help with a sick loved one. They don't have any of that. And it's a dangerous, dangerous situation. And you can only imagine the amount of stress that means. I mean, they're not saving for retirement. They can't do it. They can't buy a bigger home. It's a squeeze, and it's creating a big problem here.
I heard this last night from, and again, probably somebody who we agree with the outcomes, but polar opposite, Scott Galloway. Scott Galloway he's an NYU professor, I believe. He's written a whole bunch of books.
Say J.D. Vance. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Well, this was after. So this was but it was interesting because he was promoting the draft, and and again, from forcing people of different cultures to work together, to be teammates, to understand what the rest of the world looked like. But the other stat that he had was that there was a transfer of wealth, which is certainly confirmed by the slide, and I've got other ones that we can put up there as well. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the 20s. So it was like 25 or 26 or 27% of the wealth has been transferred from younger generations to older generations.
Yep.
And, speaking as white, all white baby boomers here, and he was as well, is what are the implications of that? That there has been a transfer of wealth. And we talked about the transfer of wealth going from, older to younger in the past, through estates and people passing it on. But for the living, the people that are trying to live paycheck to paycheck or day to day, the wealth transfer has been from the younger generations to the older generations.
You're right. Talk to young people, and I don't mean to monopolize here. You talk to young people, millennials, Gen Z, and they're, they talk about, they've now gone to a point where it's like, I'm not sure I'll ever own my own home. All of the money in my health insurance has gone through the roof. All the money is going to the older generation. There's a level of resentment there, and I have to agree with part of it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, but doesn't that depend on the demographics? And I guess this is the issue is I just came back from a cruise, and I'm fortunately in a position to be able to do that. And we ended up in Boston, and Sunday we had the opportunity to meet some family up there, and then I'm looking over the seaport, and it's like what economy, like what gap, because there's a whole lot of expensive boats and buildings, and we're walking down, and there was a for sale sign on one of the new buildings went up, and it's a 2,000 square foot. They call them homes. They're not even condos anymore. They call it a 2,000 square foot home for $4.8 million.
Right.
And it's the last one. And there's a lot of
you didn't buy it, Ira, no?
I did not buy it. But it's crazy. I mean, we have this, you have on the one side how we're prosperous, and on the other hand, we've got a group living paycheck to paycheck.
I want to come in here, Ira, and then Jeff and Matt will have an interesting take on this. The numbers you referenced there for 2023, also signified the widening of the wealth gap. I think the upper tier went to 70%, and then the lower tier expanded out. But there's a lot of theories on that. A lot of the widening gap was fueled by excessive COVID spending, money pumped into the U.S. economy, trillions by the Federal Reserve. And so it benefited those at the top tier, their equity holdings, and public companies were bailed out. So we don't know if it's a temporary blip or not, but this is pretty disturbing, because I think the bigger point that Jeff makes in his book is that if we don't have a stable middle class, a strong one, we risk anarchy and revolution. And in some people believe we're on the verge of some kind of anarchy or revolution if we don't have a satisfactory outcome in the coming election. My final point, just to add to the horrible statistics, a recent survey by Intuit Credit Karma said that 27% of Americans are skipping meals because of skyrocketing food costs. According to the same study, many are changing their food shopping habits. About 37% say they are now shopping at discount grocers. And you have to remember how the CPI is calculated. If consumers shift from one popular product to another in the meat category, the Fed automatically, recalculates how inflation is produced. So actually, if they were going by the initial goods that people have stopped buying, inflation would be probably higher today than the 3%. And prices are still rising, by the way.
Yes.
I wanted to pull up something, Jeff, and curious on your take on it, on how it applies to your book. I pulled up the latest Gallup poll. I guess they do this monthly on economic confidence in the country. And right now they said 76% of people rate the overall economy either poor or fair. It's 48% say poor, and then the other 26% say fair. But then when they're asked about their personal economic conditions, only about 5% say fair or poor, 80% say excellent, and 15% say good. Mm-hmm. So you have this massive dichotomy of I'm fine, it's my neighbor that's not. Or actually, they actually have the other question. They rate the community, and the 75% say their community economy is good, but they think the national economy is the one where it's bad. So it seems to me like there's a big disconnect between this data. And what I liked about the chart, and I'm going to go and grab your book. I don't know if I ever pulled that chart from your book or if that was something else you came up with. But I also noted what John noted was that the number of people in the upper echelon grew as a percentage of people. And so it seems like, is it possible that the data and our feelings are just totally, two ships passing in the night?
Yeah, you mean that it's the publicity and the just kind of the imagery, if you will, that things are bad, but for each of it's better. Look, it's a great question. The one about the statistic about people feeling like they're fine. It's kind of hard to believe, but it is what it is. But, anecdotally, when you just talk to the average person, average American citizen, this whole the impact of inflation, I think it's real. And, those of us who are fortunate enough to have the kind of things that Ira was talking about, inflation has affected us, but in some ways it's good. I mean, it's made the value of our property go up, right? It's made our stock portfolios go up. But the person that really doesn't have any of that is dealing with what amounts to around 25% of an increase in the last 3 years. It makes a difference. And I think those statistics don't lie. I do think that the amount of money that has been pumped into the economy, as John was talking about, during and slightly post-COVID, and the fact that we're continuing to run these huge deficits, I think that money is being pumped in the economy. And I think we're just kind of kicking the can down the road here to what could be a really, really tough situation. And when that kind of tightening takes place, we all know who gets hurt the worst, right? It's going to be those people in the middle class and the working Americans. So it's going to be interesting. I think it has not played its way out. Its play out yet.
I think the interesting one, there's many interesting lines in your book, Jeff, but the one that stood out to me, and it maybe summarizes the entire theme, your words: so long as big business and big government stay connected, American free enterprise and American freedom are in jeopardy, on page 76.
Yep. I mean, it's just whether you believe it or not. And as they say, it depends on whose ox is being gored, I guess, right? But I think, again, we see more and more of it. Look at some of the companies, especially the tech companies. You look at, even someone who I admire, Elon Musk. You look at, I mean, Trump is right when he's probably not saying it now after the announcements of the last week or so, but that, Elon Musk's wealth, much of it has been created through government subsidies for many of his companies. And I again, especially, I think that to the extent that we can really create an environment where small business can thrive again, where we can have more entrepreneurship, more innovation, more creativity. You can't prove it, but just intuitively, it seems like that would really be a good thing for our economy.
I think you can prove it.
Go ahead, Matt.
No, I think it's provable. I mean, you look around the world, and there's a strong correlation once you get away from oil countries between lack of regulation and prosperity. And there is a reason why Hong Kong got extremely wealthy, being a hands-off enclave of the United Kingdom. And there was a reason that Singapore, started off as a backwater, I don't know what it was of the United Kingdom. And, today it's probably one of the richest, if not the richest countries on earth, using free market. And as a society, they also show that they can do it while having immigration and while having, people who aren't born there coming in, assimilating and being part of the society and contributing to the wealth and creation of the society. So I agree. And I also think, you can prove it by looking at the differences in states. I mean, one of the great things about America is the state situation. We're not one country, we're 50 states.
Yep.
And you can look at states. And I think it's a really compelling argument when I hear, Gavin Newsom defend heavily California's success, in spite of what people from the outside look at as tyrannical laws. But all of the richest companies in the United States of America, aside from Microsoft and Amazon, but they're in high tax states too. But Nvidia, all of Tesla's, all of Elon Musk's companies started there. I know that he's moving them to Texas, but California does have a long defendable track record of building massive companies, and they're doing something that's working that also doesn't necessarily seem to be aligned with we need to have small business favors, because there's nothing in California that seems to favor small business. Believe me, I have employees there.
No, it's an interesting fact that so many of those companies are beginning to leave now, and have left. But you again, listen, it doesn't take spending much time. You got people who haven't spent time in California, go there for the first time, look around, and you've got the climate, and you've got the ocean, and the mountains, and no bugs, and it's like, this is going to be a great place to live, and millions of people live there. But you're right, a lot of the big companies are either headquartered there or started there. But I think that I don't know. Again, it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years with this migration of companies to Texas and Florida, Tennessee, places where taxes are low and they're very business friendly. It's again, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the trend plays out.
You mentioned, Jeff, about how in 2017, I think it was, Trump had some kind of a symbolic ceremony about, cutting Fed regulation. And I think the number of pages that his aides calculated constituted the number of regulations in America came to a fat 185,000 pages. Nobody in their right mind could go through all that. No attorneys. The whole thing was run amok, and he vowed to get that way back, maybe back to 20,000 pages, and to simplify the language. And you do make a compelling case that the less regulation there is, the more prosperity there is. And the ordinary, well, I shouldn't use the word ordinary, but a lot of Americans are not aware of that when small business tries to start up, many of them are deeply discouraged because they say, what the heck, it's not worth all this red tape.
And many of them fail because of the red tape, even if they get started. That's right. It's when I speak to young entrepreneurs, we talk about when I go through the story of building the company that I built from scratch. I always say at the end, it's like, I do think that in some ways it's easier to start a small company now, especially tech. You don't need a lot of people and all of that kind of complexity. But on the other hand, as you begin to scale that business, think your regulations make it tougher. I think it's harder. And I think that we're probably going to see if Trump is elected, and if there's not a new Russiagate, which I'm sure there will be, I think you're going to see. I think you're going to see a much more aggressive whack at the federal bureaucracy, regulations, the federal budget, and so on. I know that's the plan. You have to remember, Trump never expected to get elected, and they didn't have any bench ready to go. So I think you'll see a lot more if that happens.
Do you think? How do you think interest rate policy affects the middle class and what we're talking about today?
I think obviously interest rates affect the economy and as far as growth in the economy. And we can talk about whether we really should have had 20 years of lower interest rates and what the long-term effect of that's going to be. But again, look at what a home mortgage is now. I mean, it's just, you get, again, the three major issues from the man on the street are, it's groceries, it's gas, and it's housing. I mean, that's what they're thinking about, and that's what they're affected most by day to day. So I think it's a very good question. There's no question that high interest rates, if they're high for very long, they're going to have an effect. What it's done so far, I think, is kind of arguable. But again, I go back to these young people and the number of people that feel like that they've kind of gotten a bad draw when they came along, and when all the different crises have developed, they've been in the middle of it and been affected by it. And whether they will ever recover or not, I think there's a lot of concern.
There's a part of me that wonders how. Going back to my first question on the gap between people, talking about themselves and then talking about others, amongst young people who are, you listen to Scott Galloway, and he presents such a compelling, just tight synopsis of why younger generations, or I don't know what the right word would be. I don't want to call them bitter or whatever, but like they feel like for some reason that they've been left behind. And then I'm in the securities industry, and we go to these conferences, and all we talk about is the mountains of transfer of wealth that's going to happen as the greatest generation finishes, moving on, and then the baby boomers start dying and passing on this immense amount of wealth. And you can look at different charts depending on how they angle them. There are charts out there that show millennials are just as wealthy at on average at age 30 as their parents were, as we were, as anyone else was, and that a lot of this is just perception. And then not only is it just the perception, but the perception doesn't match the reality. My kids talk to me about, like, oh, when you were growing up, was it cool when you got your first color TV? And I'm like, no, yes, the technology has changed a lot in my lifetime. Yeah. But my parents were there. My grandparents didn't have TVs, and my grandfather didn't have indoor plumbing. Our parents had TVs, they had cars, my dad talks about how he used to take a cruise ship to go to Europe because they couldn't afford to fly. And now it's no big deal for even the lowest middle class family to plan a trip to Europe. We all have, the entire world body of knowledge and news real time in your pocket. Our society has an abundance of calories, so much so that when I was growing up, we used to do fundraisers to feed the starving kids. And now it's all about obesity, even in Africa, even in Asia. I know there's pockets of poverty throughout the world and stuff, but I just wonder if there's just a disconnect between people's lived lives, because our lives are actually pretty darn great.
Yeah. Well, medical care is so much better now than it used to be. I mean, with all the advancements there. So there are those basic things that you make a good case for that. But it's certainly true that most of them feel like, correct, like you say, maybe some of it's perception. I know. One of the things I hear a lot about is kind of what's happening with Social Security, the medical care, insurance rates, that they're just so high, and that all that money for medical care is being transferred to take care of our generation, if you will. And to be honest, there's some truth to that. There is some.
And I think some of what Matt was saying may be related to a kind of I go back to it all the time, this moral relativism that has crept into our culture, the wokeism, if you will. And by the way, Charlie Gasparino has a new book out, Go Woke, Go Broke. It's great context. You know, and, you know, a kind of a despair, because you're right, things ain't too bad. I wanted to ask you, although there are definitely pockets of poverty, let's be very clear about this. But Jeff, you mentioned tariffs in your book. You have a special section on fair trade and free trade, and you're going to get beaten up by some people on this, because there's fears now that if there are tariffs imposed under Trump, it'll lead to more inflation. But I think your argument is, if it's done strategically, it protects us all.
Well, I think that's right. I think it's, you know, it's like most things, right? It all comes down to execution. Again, the one thing I will say about Trump is that he knows how to make a deal, and I think that I think that he's smart enough and left smart enough people around him, where the application of these kind of targeted tariffs, you know, in the long run, certainly, who knows, in the short run, will be balanced, and I think good for us. But who knows? It really just depends. I mean, tariffs can be used; they can be weaponized, and they can even with the best of intentions, they can end up hurting us in the long run. So I think it'll have to be very targeted and analyzed the right way for the short term and the long term. But I do think, but also, again, I know I'm sounding like this. I guess it's because I just came back from Milwaukee, but J.D. Vance's story is remarkable, his personal story. And, you know, coming from Appalachia and talking about the ruin that happened with the loss of manufacturing jobs and what that did culturally to the people in those small towns. You know, the drug use, the lack of the ability to have a job and do the things that need to be done to move forward. So I think that there has to be some type of balance. And, you know, it's going to have to be, in this country, we're going to have, I believe, even with AI and even with technology, what it is, we're going to have manufacturing in this country. We're going to have good jobs for average people. And I think we can do a better job at it. And I don't think there's a silver bullet, you know, I don't think so. But I think you kind of have to get started, and you have to have that as one of your objectives. You know, it needs to be that yes, the pie can get bigger, but we've got to make sure that everybody gets to benefit as things move along. Easier said than done, I understand, but I think you got to at least start with that.
Beyond tariffs, which is beyond the scope of what a lot of people would even understand,
Right.
What that means and how it affects it. You basically went through almost step by step. You went through a number of different changes of how we got here, you know, and if you don't fix the cause, we're just treating the symptoms. So there's a number of different scenarios that you shared in your book that you outlined, of saying how did we get into this situation? Why are we having this conversation today, and why does it matter? Can you highlight, you know, what you feel are some of the strongest, you know, points there that, you know, if you had to prioritize your list
about how we got to this discrepancy and
how we got here, which is the causes, and then, you know, what some of the remedies might be.
Yeah, well, look, I think that I keep putting this at the top of the list now. It's evolved to the top of the list. I'm scared to death of the national debt and where we're going, with no solution, with no end in sight, and very few people even talking about it, right? And how do we get out of it? I mean, you talk about something that we're leaving to our children and our grandchildren. I mean, I read the other day that that in 2025, that the interest payment on the national debt will be $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion. What could we do with $1 trillion in this country? What could we do really for infrastructure? What could we do to invest in the future? And I think as interest on the debt continues to expand, then it takes money out of kind of the normal operating cycle within our society. I think it's a huge problem, and I don't think there are too many ways to pay back that debt that are going to be, you know, less than painful. I mean, you know, with something like this, you inflate the currency. Well, we're seeing what happens there, I guess, a little bit now. You have the company go bankrupt to start over. You can't do that. I mean, I actually think Trump has the best idea, and that is drill, baby, drill. I mean, back to the oil, the hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and the reserves that we have in this country, more than any other country in the world, to the extent that our country could be selling oil and gas, which is going to be here for a long time, to the rest of the world. I think that's the best solution. But the national debt. I think also what's happening now. We didn't talk too much about this in the book. I think what's happening with our colleges and universities and their inability to keep up with. And this is not all of them. Keep up with what's needed for our society going forward. I also don't think they're doing a very good job of teaching our young people about the history of our country and our economy. And to your point about less regulation, more free markets, things that got us to this point. And there seems to be this lack of general direction and how we're going forward and how we're going to get better as a society. But I think the national debt is a ticking time bomb.
I want to challenge you a bit on that one.
Okay.
I first off, I don't think I try to be contrarian when I can, at least put forth a good foot on it, but I'm not necessarily trying to take the other side. Japan has national debt of around 300% debt to GDP, and they've been above 120% debt to GDP for 30, 40 years. And everyone's been calling for the end of Japan, or like, this is the year when the yen finally goes to 300. This is, and that's the first example you have out there. And it doesn't seem to have mattered to Japan for at least 3 or 4 decades. Second, we are not any other country in the world. We are the US dollar. We can print the US dollar. Your point was, you said, I don't know how they plan to solve it. Well, there's actually a bunch of plans to solve it. Most of them are wackadoodle, but they do work. They do work. And the reality is one of the reasons we have such a huge national debt isn't necessarily all due to Congress. It's also due to demand. It's also due to how we've structured the global economy, in the sense that we are the global reserve currency. Something like 90% of all cross-border transactions that aren't intra-Europe use the US dollar or currency that's referenced to the US dollar. And a lot of people hold US treasuries not because they're long-term believers in the United States, but because they don't have anywhere else to park the money.
That's right.
And one person's debt is another person's asset. And so treasuries, you could look at it the opposite way and say there's $35 trillion of treasuries out there held by people who are believers. And they hold it because it's the great place, and especially at today's interest rates, it's a great place to hold money. And so I just wonder, like, everyone uses, I guess, household accounting when thinking about the national debt, but it's actually something else. The national debt is assets, and it's a reflection of the United States. So I just wonder if maybe you're not being a little bit too negative on that.
But yeah, probably could. I'm pretty conservative, and I know how I feel about debt. I don't have any. I never have had any, thankfully. But I do. Again, I go back. As the debt gets larger, the interest payment's going to get larger, unless interest rates come down again, which we can argue about whether that's going to happen or not. I mean, it has to happen, but at what point? And what's really happening with inflation is, I think John was saying a minute ago, prices are still going up. I mean, we see it every day. And is it going to become normalized, or can you live with this level of inflation on and on and on? But I do think, I hear what you're saying about people investing here, Matt, and there being our debt being kind of an asset, if you will. But at the end of the day, it still is debt. It's going to have to be paid somehow, some way. And we don't have the answer yet. And as far as Japan is concerned, my only pushback there is, I can remember when Japan was leading the way in all type of innovation and business and manufacturing, and they're okay now, they're good, but they're not what they were. I mean, we were all trying to emulate Japan and the way they did business and the way they ran factories and everything. And even though they're doing pretty well when it comes to automobiles, I think that their leadership has slowed down to some extent. So
Let's get something in here, which was very interesting on lobbying in Washington, D.C., which you cover, Jeff, in your book. And you mentioned a lot of Americans don't know about this, the 1984 Chevron deference ruling, if you will, or decision of the Supreme Court, which is effectively introduced lobbying as an industry into D.C. And you come up with some number, I don't know where you got it, like an average of $3 million over a 4-year cycle is given to each congressperson. Now, it maybe not individually, and that's highly detrimental to the functioning of a healthy democracy, and it's undue influencing, and it really hurts people in the middle class ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, people have been buying favors for a long time in government, right? But the matter is that and by the way, on Chevron being overturned to some extent in the last couple of weeks, kind of got lost in the shuffle of all the headlines, right? Because people don't really understand it, and it's pretty complicated. But to the extent that we allow non-elected government officials who can't be fired, pretty much, to actually have more to do with how the laws are applied once they've been made in a general way by Congress. People don't understand what a negative influence that has been on our society. But I do think that look at all these people that go to Congress and are very, very, are not affluent at all, and they spend 10 or 12 even more years there. They all retire multimillionaires. I mean, they just do. I mean, somebody should look at Paul Ryan, for instance, if you want to take a good look at that. But it happens, and you're right. It doesn't always go directly to them. It may go to their campaign. It's very common also for these, first of all, these congressmen hear about plans and what we're doing and what the next big construction push is going to be. So, they end up with their family members, involved in bidding on big projects, or their best friends, and then they go on the board of that company. I mean, one of the term limits to me would be one of the most positive things that could happen in this country. And we should say, people go, we can have change because, we can do it at the ballot box. Look at the number of people of incumbents, the percentage of incumbents that are reelected every time. And, we can argue about, how long term should be and whether or not having somebody there that has experience is important. I just think you have to look at some of the problems that have been created. And I think that having people with almost a lifetime of employment in the government it is not a good thing. And I do think that there is kind of this wealth transfer there. I think it's unfair, and I think it hurts us in a lot of different ways.
We're coming up toward the end, and I'm sure there's a million other topics that we can go down. But what I'd like to do is just go around the kind of the circle here and ask, I'll start with John. If there was a question that he hoped we asked, but we didn't, and then hopefully somebody else can partake in or participate in a response. So, John,
we just didn't have enough time to drill even deeper in Jeff's book and his thoughts, because he mentioned one of his themes is consolidation of power in America, in industry and financial services. And there's a really striking stat on the banking industry. At the time of the financial crisis, there was 7,200 commercial banks. That was in 2007 to 2008. In 1985, there was 14,000. The number of commercial banks has even shrunk even further still. And you say that the big banks get too much of a pass, too big to fail banks. They have a monopoly position, and it hurts the middle class.
I think so. I mean, listen, I have my own share of experience in antitrust, by the way, but I do believe. I think it's big as bad is what we say in there, John. But I do think that the banking industry is a good example. I mean, you have less competition. You have more power in a smaller number of institutions. And what industry, what company should be too big to fail? I mean, how the hell do you have the kind of discipline you should have if you know that you're going to be bailed out if you make bad decisions? I mean, it's like, what we saw, with mortgages and I would suggest what we've seen in the student loan business, by the way, where, you again, the people at the end of the line, the people who really end up, financing all these things are going to be bailed out. And it's not reasonable to think that people are going to make the kind of decisions we all have to make when we make our own decisions and take our own risks, when we weigh out risk versus reward. So
I kind of feel like that's more of a cyclical thing of, the country. I mean, going back to even the founding of the country with Alexander Hamilton, we started with a totally different economic system where everyone had local banks, and those banks issued local currency, and there was an exchange rate if you wanted to go from DC to New York. Well, I guess DC didn't exist at the time, but from Virginia to New York, you had an exchange rate. And you can take it all the way up to Andrew Jackson with the Second Bank of the United States and him shutting down that charter. And you bring it forward to J.P. Morgan, not the bank, but James Pierpont Morgan, the man, kind of doing the role of a Federal Reserve Bank in the 1910s during the economic crisis before the Roaring 20s. And then you had Glass-Steagall, which was kind of in response to that. And then you had the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and then you have the financial crisis, and you have the new regime that we're in with 4 or 5 too big to fail banks that are really, I agree, doing huge economic distortion, because what they're kind of incentivized to do is to grow their balance sheets and take free money, knowing that they're going to be bailed out. Whereas the traditional role of the bank was to create money through loaning and having a personal relationship with the community that they're in. And now you have 5 of the top biggest banks. I can't remember the numbers, but I think it's like something like 50 or 60% of the deposits are in 5 banks, which is basically one bank. I mean, because they're all under the same special rules. And so I totally agree. And I didn't mean to hog the floor and take an answer from John's, but I totally agree.
Great explanation.
My question would be, when I feel like my real question I have is, do the definitions count anymore? And I go back to this LBJ stuff of war on poverty. And there was a good definition back then. I don't know what it was. It was probably like $1 a day or something like that. And you look around, and my daughter, my kids' schools, we do a lot of charity work, and we go to various areas where we help people who are of need. And I'm not sure I'm going to the worst places. I'm definitely not going to Appalachia. I'm not, but everywhere we go, the people who are poor that we're helping out have air conditioning, have cars, have TVs,
have plenty of food,
and I listened to my parents talk about, like, especially my dad, when he took a road trip across the South in the 1960s, early 1960s, before before the Civil Rights Acts were passed and before all the changes. And he would describe to me poor, like no shoes. Kids are running around with no shoes. They have an outhouse. They're drinking dirty water. They can't afford to go to school because they can't afford, like, I feel like the definition hasn't kept up, and today's poor live better than 99% of the people did in, call it, 1900. And then we were like, oh, but they're poor. Well, are they really that poor? Or is it just in my head? And it's like, and you want to have empathy, but we're not actually giving society credit for how much progress that today's poor, broadly speaking, has access to healthcare, access to air conditioning, access to clean food, access to clean water, access to transportation, cell phones. I mean, I would live in New York City. I walk around, and you see the homeless people, and it's awful. But homeless people, they used to go for shelters. Now they go for where they can find an outlet and charge their device overnight. So I just wonder if the definition hasn't quite kept up.
Yeah, I think some of that too is a social breakdown, social malaise, family breakdown, the fentanyl crisis, obviously, changing social and cultural mores, and the law of rising expectations. Each generation feels they deserve more than the previous. So we have to reestablish some kind of a new norm, as it were.
Yeah, I would just say to Matt and to everybody, I'm on the board of the YMCA, our regional YMCA, and I can tell you that there are children that do not get fed. There are children that are homeless. There are people. And I had used this word elderly, but because I'm considered amongst them.
Is that due to lack of resources? Is that due to lack of resources, or is it just misallocation of resources?
The issues that are being worked on are lack of affordable housing, which is a huge problem. The only way that many young children receive any meal during the summer, is through nonprofits and the Y and feeding programs, because there is no food at home. So it's getting into certain areas, but they've almost been isolated areas. They're almost protected, almost camps, and a lot of them are in the cities. But I live in the Lehigh Valley, so we've got pockets of that in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We've got it in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We got it in Easton, Pennsylvania. You have it in some of the small communities. So it's there, but it's usually, it's in a particular part of the city, and therefore it's isolated and you don't go there. So you don't necessarily sit it. And that's sort of, that's the Appalachia. I mean, I grew up in the northern parts of Appalachian, a coal mining town. We used to have 12,000 people thriving downtown. Now it's infested, literally. It sounds like J.D. Vance. I mean, it is that there's 5,000 people, and the biggest industry is probably drugs and fentanyl. And it was really, my classmates will still say it's the best place we grew up in the world, but it's really not the ideal place, anymore. But they weren't foreign immigrants. I mean, they were coming because it was cheaper than doing it in North Philly. It was cheaper to move to the coal regions and manufacture and do this stuff. So, it's a challenge, but it exists, Matt.
Yeah.
And
so there is real poverty. Yeah, there is real hunger.
But I absolutely agree with your definition, because when I looked up the definition, when I started to research this and get more, not that I was aware that the middle class was shrinking, but not to the extent that Jeff is exposed, is that when you look at what the range of how they define middle class, it went from like $47,000 to $187,000. I mean, I can, and again, it depends on where you're living.
Yeah.
But $47,000 isn't a lot to live on almost anywhere. No. I mean, there are discrepancies between that and living in Manhattan, but there are discrepancies there. And so I think I think your question is incredibly valid, that we need to take a look at these definitions of that. And again, and there's always this asterisk after middle class, depends on demographics and geography. But
I think in that chart, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong, I think it defined it as anyone living below 2/3 of the median income line.
Yeah.
Which means if you're going to use median income as your starting point, you're always going to have statistically people below that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if that's what you're measuring, then you're never going to succeed, because there's always going to be 1/3 of the society that has that level of income.
Yeah, we didn't.
One thing too, I think, Matt, you were talking about allocation, and John, you were talking about kind of the cultural effects. I mean, we look how much more money we spend in trying to address this issue. I think the question becomes, how are we spending that money? And I think you're right about drugs being number one, with the number one industry in a lot of these places. I agree with that. I just think that what we're going to do about poverty is a much bigger conversation, I guess.
Yeah, but, exactly. But there is real poverty. We see it at the food banks. So nobody wants to be callous or it's a real problem, obviously. But Matt's question was very valid.
Yeah, and I know Matt needs to log off, but Jeff, what's the question? And Matt, if you need to go, we appreciate it. It's always great to have you, and appreciate you to be here. We'll be back next month. hopefully with another conversation. But I want to give fair time to Jeff too. So Jeff, was there something that you needed to you wanted to ask that we would, or you wanted to talk about that we didn't?
No, I think, look, this has been a great conversation, and it's a conversation that will never end. And I do feel like we can look at a lot of the charts and numbers, statistics we need to do, but there's almost this intuitive sense about what's happening to these people. It's a lot of it's anecdotal. I try to talk to as many of them as I can, and whether it's the fact that it's perception that things are getting worse, or they really getting, I guess we'll never really know. But I think that what's happened with inflation in the last couple of years has such a negative impact on their psyche, and one would assume their actual wallets. But that's they're starting to. There's not the same sense that they're going to have the same level of opportunity that people have had in the past, and that's something that we have to address all the way around. Whether it's reality, whether it's perception, or whatever, in order to keep the country and keep the middle class doing what it's done for our country and our economy, there has to be a positive attitude, a sense that I can do this, I can achieve more, I can do more for my family, and that's what's slipping away. And I think it's dangerous, but hopefully we can move it.
Yeah, and I think despite everything that's going on, there's a recognition that there's a huge difference between data and emotions. And, that's what we're talking about with deflation, and hopefully that recognition that we need to listen to how people feel and not what the data, not what the data reflects all the time. And I've got one last quick question for you, Jeff. This is probably the compelling question that we didn't talk about. When will we see cheerleading in the Olympics?
You're talking about my other life now, Ira, my other life, right? So there's a long answer to that, and I'm actually going to be in Paris, the IOC meetings next week. But the Olympic Games, people don't understand. It's not that it's political; it's the fact that there's a set number of athletes and coaches. They call it, and the trainers, they call it entourage. That can be in the games. That's set. A lot of it's cost and so on. And so for somebody to go in, somebody has to come out, and all of those other international sports federations will fight to the death to stay in there. But we got recognized as fast as any sport ever.
It's incredible.
We've got a sport that skews young. It's for all genders, all body types. It's entertaining. It's telegenic. It involves music. It fits the bill of what young people are looking for. So we're doing everything we can to get in as soon as we can, but it ain't easy. Let me put it like
it's a great story. I know there's so many people that I know that I was shocked when people said, "Hey, every weekend they're going to a cheerleading competition," and it gave a lot of people, both young girls and young boys, an opportunity to do something that if they weren't good at baseball or football or basketball or soccer, and they had another opportunity. So you created a huge opportunity for people. Jeff, what's the best way to get for people to get in touch with you?
It's the best thing for especially on things like this is jwebb@humanevents.com.
Okay, and your book's available up on Amazon, American Restoration.
It is. Thank you.
I encourage people to go up and get that. We want to thank you. I know you had an incredibly busy schedule, got to get up really early, and I appreciate you meeting your commitment and being here. It was a great conversation.
It's been my pleasure. It's great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah. And before we log off, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge Security Traders Association again. You can go to their website at securitytraders.org and get information about the organization and also their upcoming annual conference, which is focused on shifting the landscape, which is what we've been talking about today. And until next month, don't let the shift hit your plans.
Thanks for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. Be sure to listen to the podcast and follow us on YouTube.